It was supposed to be an ordinary evening, the kind of night where dinner happens late, the baby refuses to sleep, and the cold outside matches the one in your chest. But for her, a new mom, running on no sleep and fighting a brutal cold, that night turned into something else entirely. Because when her husband walked through the door after work, she thought, just maybe, he'd notice the exhaustion in her eyes. Maybe he'd say, "Don't worry, I'll handle the baby tonight." Instead, he grabbed his jacket, smiled faintly, and said, "I have that thing tonight. Remember?" And just like that, he left. The door closed, and the sound echoed louder than it should have. She stood there, baby in arms, body aching, nose running, trying to breathe through a mix of sickness and disbelief. He'd been planning this event for months, sure, but she'd been planning on partnership. And as the night stretched on, the question she couldn't shake wasn't about germs or sleep or even resentment. It was simpler. When did being someone's partner stop meaning showing up when it matters most? The house felt colder after he left, not because the heat was off, but because the silence hit harder than the sickness. The baby had already started crying again, 4 months old. Sleep regression, teething. The kind of night where minutes feel like hours, and hours feel like survival. She rocked him gently, whispering through her sore throat, her body heavy with exhaustion. Every muscle ached. Her skin burned from fever, and every time she closed her eyes, she felt that quiet resentment start to rise again. He'd said it so casually. "I've had this planned for months." Like partnership was something that could be penciled in on a calendar. What he didn't see were the moments between the moments, the small, invisible things that held their little family together. The way she measured medicine at 2 a.m., the way she sang lullabies when she could barely speak, the way she smiled through fatigue so her baby wouldn't feel her frustration. Tonight, none of that mattered, because when she needed help most, she was still alone. Not in theory, not metaphorically, but literally. And somewhere between a crying baby and a half-empty bottle, it hit her. This wasn't about one night. It was about every night that came before. All the small times he didn't show up. All the times she told herself, "It's fine." But now, with fever sweat on her forehead and her baby's tiny hand gripping her shirt, she realized maybe fine was just another word for unfinished resentment. By morning, she was drained, physically, emotionally, and everything in between. The baby had cried on and off all night, her fever hadn't broken, and the quiet resentment she tried to swallow had turned into something heavier. So she did what millions of women do when they start to wonder if they're losing their mind or their patience. She opened her phone, went online, and asked the internet for help. Her post was simple, honest, vulnerable. "My husband went out to an event he's had planned for months, even though I'm home sick with a horrible cold and taking care of our 4-month-old alone. Am I being unreasonable for feeling upset?" It wasn't an attack. It wasn't rage. It was a cry for validation, for someone, anyone, to say, "You're not crazy. This hurts because it matters." Within hours, her story blew up on Mumsnet, the UK-based community where women share advice, frustrations, and late-night confessions. And as usual, the internet split in two. Half the comments said she was right, that marriage is about showing up when your partner needs you, not when it's convenient. The other half? They told her to let it go. "It's just one evening," one user said. "You had help during the day. Take some medicine and rest." Another added, "If he'd stayed home, you'd just feel guilty he missed something he planned for months." The messages kept coming, like waves. Logic clashing with emotion, empathy fighting against practicality. But somewhere between those replies, she realized what she was really asking wasn't, "Was I right?" It was something deeper. "If I can't count on him when I'm sick, when can I?" As the comments kept rolling in, one truth started to settle in her chest, heavier than her cold, heavier than the exhaustion. Love isn't about grand gestures. It's about presence. And lately, his presence had started to feel more like a privilege than a promise. She thought back to the night before, the empty couch, the crying baby, the way she stared at the door, hoping to hear his key turn in the lock. But it didn't. Not until hours later. He'd come home quietly, trying not to wake the baby. But what he didn't realize was that she was already awake. Not from illness, from disappointment. He whispered, "You okay?" And she almost laughed. Because no, she wasn't okay. But she didn't want to explain it anymore. It wasn't about one night out. It wasn't about missing bedtime or breaking a promise. It was about that growing gap. The one that forms when one person keeps showing up and the other keeps finding reasons not to. That's when she realized something most people don't say out loud. There's a difference between loving someone and feeling responsible for them. For months, she'd carried the weight of every bottle, every diaper, every 3 a.m. cry, all while trying to protect his rest, his plans, his peace. But who was protecting hers? Marriage, she thought, wasn't supposed to feel like a one-sided favor. It was supposed to feel like teamwork. And maybe that's the saddest part. When love turns into obligation, when showing up feels optional, and when the person you depend on becomes the person you can't depend on. By the end of the day, her post wasn't just another late-night vent. It had become a full-blown debate. Hundreds of strangers were weighing in, dissecting her marriage like it was a case study in modern love. Some users called her story heartbreaking. Others said she was being unfair. But no one could stop talking about it. "You have every right to be upset," one woman wrote. "It's not about the cold. It's about feeling invisible." Another shot back. "It's one night. You can't expect your husband to cancel everything just because you're sick. That's not partnership. That's control." The arguments stacked up like dominoes, one opinion triggering the next. Some saw empathy, others saw entitlement. And buried in the noise was a bigger question. What does it really mean to be a good partner? Because for every person who said he should have stayed home, there was another saying, "She's asking too much." It was strange. Watching strangers argue over her life, her choices, her feelings. But it also gave her something she hadn't felt in weeks: perspective. For the first time, she realized this wasn't just about being sick or feeling lonely. It was about patterns. The ones that build quietly over time until they feel normal. And sometimes, it takes the internet to hold up the mirror you've been avoiding. Scrolling through the thread, she paused on one comment that hit harder than all the others. If this was reversed, would he even be wondering if he was unreasonable? Or would he just expect you to handle it? She didn't need to answer, because deep down, she already knew. That night, after the baby finally fell asleep, she sat alone on the couch, scrolling through the last few comments on her post. The house was quiet again, but it didn't feel peaceful. It felt heavy. Somewhere between the words, "You're overreacting and he doesn't deserve you," a single thought cut through the noise. When did I start expecting so little? She looked around the living room, bottles on the counter, laundry waiting to be folded, the faint sound of white noise humming from the baby monitor, and realized that every piece of this house had her fingerprints on it. Her energy, her care, her time. And suddenly, the question wasn't whether her husband should have stayed home. It was whether she'd been settling for a version of love that only worked when she wasn't asking for anything. Because that's what it had become. A quiet deal she never agreed to. She'd keep things running, keep the peace, keep him comfortable. And in return, she'd get a pat on the back and the illusion of partnership. But that's not partnership. That's survival. She remembered how, early in their marriage, he used to bring her tea when she was sick, how he'd text during the day just to say, "You doing okay?" Somewhere along the line, that tenderness had been replaced by convenience. And she knew. If she didn't speak up soon, that version of her, the one who believed love meant mutual care, would disappear completely. So she closed the app, put down her phone, and whispered to herself, "This isn't about one night. It's about every night I stopped asking for more." And for the first time, the thought of being alone didn't scare her. It sounded peaceful. The next morning, the house looked the same, but something in her had changed. The air felt lighter, sharper, like she'd been holding her breath for months and finally exhaled. He walked into the kitchen, coffee mug in hand, humming like nothing had happened, and for the first time, she didn't look away. "Can we talk?" she said softly. He nodded, distracted. "Sure. What's up?" She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She just spoke the truth. Steady, calm, and tired in the way only a person who's been holding it together too long can be. "Last night wasn't about you going out. It was about me realizing I can't depend on you anymore." He froze. The mug stopped midair. "You knew I was sick. You knew I was up all night with the baby. And you still left. I would have stayed if it were you. Not because I had to, but because that's what love looks like." He opened his mouth, then closed it. For once he didn't have an excuse. No schedule, no plans, no "you're overreacting." She continued, "I don't need you to fix everything. I just needed you to show up. And I realized last night that's something I can't keep begging for." The silence between them said everything his words couldn't. It wasn't anger anymore. It wasn't even sadness. It was acceptance. That quiet, painful kind that comes when you finally see things for what they are. He set the mug down, staring at her like he was seeing her for the first time. But it was too late, because she wasn't the same woman who waited up for him last night. She was the one who finally stopped waiting. Later that day, she packed a small overnight bag, not out of anger, but clarity. She told him she was going to stay with her sister for a few days, not to punish him, not to make a point, but to breathe. As she closed the door behind her, she didn't feel victorious, just free. Because sometimes strength isn't about fighting for someone to change. It's about realizing you deserve someone who doesn't need to be asked. Love isn't measured by the grand gestures or the years spent under the same roof. It's measured by the moments when showing up feels inconvenient, and you do it anyway. Some people online called her unreasonable. Others said she was brave. But truthfully, it wasn't about being right or wrong. It was about finally listening to herself. Maybe her husband would realize what he lost. Maybe he wouldn't. That part didn't matter anymore. Because that night, for the first time in a long time, she slept through the night. No crying baby, no resentment, no waiting for the sound of the door, just silence and peace. And maybe that's the part no one talks about. That sometimes the real ending to a love story isn't dramatic or tragic. It's just stillness. And the quiet understanding that the person you needed to take care of all along was you.